I always think that hearing personal stories is the best way to kind of understand some of these things. So I just wrote, I've written about residential schools quite a bit. I've written about them in graphic novels. I've written about them in picture books, and I've written about them in novels, in a personal novel, which is a memoir called Blackwater. And I've done them in all of these different forms of literature because I wanted to have a book for every age, because I think it's so important. I think stories play a really important role in educating people about the truths of the past and of the present, and especially stories that are written by people who have lived experiences in their families or directly. My grandmother went to a place called Norway House residential school, and she was, I think she was probably in her early teens when she started attending a residential school, maybe a bit younger than that, maybe 9 years old, around there. They came from a community called God's Lake, in even farther north than my dad grew up in Norway House, and there was no residential school in God's Lake. And one of the things that I think that maybe some people don't know is that usually prior to 1950, Indigenous people, if you were status, which means if you were like a treaty Indian, you were required to go to residential school legally, and that meant you had no option. Like, it was like your parents were often threatened with being fined or imprisoned if they kept you from going to residential school. And certainly a lot of parents hid their children from having to go, and either were successful or were caught and had their kids taken away from them. And so my grandmother and her family moved down to Norway House from God's Lake because they were required to go to residential school. And so she had two siblings, and she started going in the early 1920s. And Norway House residential school was not a pleasant school to go to say the least, I guess, for children. One of the things that I think is important to note is that, my grandmother never told her story, because back then in the, even before, well, even 15 or so years ago, elders who had attended residential school and survivors, because really the last school closed down only about 25 years ago, didn't really have a safe space to tell their stories. So it wasn't something that was really encouraged, and there was still a lot of shame involved with survivors, because they didn't know how to deal with some of the things that they had been through. And there was, I think, a lot of guilt and shame with the stuff that they experienced. And so my grandmother, she died in, I think, 1984, and was never able to tell her story. And so some of the things that I've had to kind of come to terms with was knowing that she went to the school, knowing what happened at the school, and then not knowing what she experienced at the school. If she somehow avoided a lot of the bad things, which seems unlikely, but the fact that we don't know that, we have to, I don't know, find some sort of peace with that, I guess, somehow.